Hello, it's week 4, and by the end of this week, you'll be halfway through this class. I am enjoying getting to see how you all are processing some of this information by the examples that I ask for in both the forums and the tests. And so I, for the most part, don't think any of you are really missing the boat. We have one little boat that some of you all missed in the test. I'll talk about that in a minute, but let's talk about the housekeeping things first, and then we'll talk about chapter 17 to 21. Then I will let you go. I am in the process of still grading the tests. Part of there are a few reasons why it's taking so long. Part of the reason is because even though I ask you all to be succinct, 5 to 6 to 7 sentences, some of you all have written essays for the answer. So I'm going to point that out. It will be pointed out at the top of the test. What that does is it takes me a full hour to grade 2 questions. All right. Because what I do is I get the answer to number 1 in my head, and then I grade everybody's number 1. Number 2, grade everybody's number 2, etc. And with 33 of you in here, I think we're down to 32 now, but with 32 of you in here, if you all are writing essays, it's going to take a long time for me to grade. So 5, 6, 7 sentences. Not 1 or 2 sentences, which some of you all have had the problem with that too, but more of you have had the problem with way too much in the answer. And so I will ask you all to watch for that on test number 2. I am also behind in grading forum questions because, well, one reason is because I'm trying to get the test graded, and when I get a free minute, that's what I do. I think most of y'all know that I'm the assistant chair, and one of my duties is to plan the schedules. The spring schedule right now is what we're working on, and that has eaten up my time all this past week. And it's nonstop in my office. You've all been watching when people knock on my door on a Sunday morning. So it's like, okay. So I will, I'll get caught up before the grades are due. I haven't noticed anything in the forum so far. There have been a couple times where I've taken off some points, and even those of you that were completely off the mark, I gave you half credit on it. So the forums are going well. The test, this is Sunday morning. I will hopefully, if it doesn't take me, I'm on question. I just finished question 7 last night. And so as long as I'm not doing an hour for every 2, I should be done by this evening. I'm going to start skimming those of you that wrote too long because I just don't have the time to grade that. Also, a few of you all put links to videos in there. I don't have time to go watch the video. It so happens the ones I've seen so far, I have seen those speeches, and that's where I'm going on the next topic. Interpersonal communication and public communication are not the same thing, all right? Public communication is public speeches. In the questions where I asked you for some interpersonal communication examples, all right, where somebody didn't, pay attention to the other person and chose the wrong language, or said the wrong thing or did the wrong things. There were a few of you all who chose public speeches at that point. A public speech is not interpersonal communication. So please make sure interpersonal communication is defined as, and if you go back to the section before we began the interpersonal theories, you'll find it there too. But in short, it's defined as 2 to 7 people communicating in a face-to-face situation, right? Not a public setting. So the public setting is completely different. And in fact, we're going to talk about that next. In the next, after group communication, we'll talk about public communication. So small group communication is this next section, with starting with chapter 17. and public communication is in that section too. And the dynamics are different in group settings or face-to-face setting, and group communication, small group communication, is also an interpersonal setting. So anyway, I think that's the housekeeping things for this week, and we'll see if I don't think of something else while I'm talking to you about what's in the chapters. We begin with the chapter 17, well, actually this group decision-making section of group and public communication that are grouped together, which to me doesn't make sense, but that's where they put it. Because group communication is not public communication unless the group is making a group presentation. So anyway, let's look at that. The opening part, the introductory part to group decision making, group communication, has to do with looking at the synergy that, how a group works and functions together. How do they get the things that they need to do? Now, most of y'all probably work in a job where you have to do some group work with other people. That's the most common form of work in the workplace. So that's why this section is important to communication theories, is because you have the issue of, one of the things bosses are looking for when they're going to hire somebody is somebody who can do teamwork. That's what teamwork refers to, is be able to work in a group. All right, so this section here is important to those of you in the workplace. And you'll probably see some things in this material that point you to that that whole process of paying attention to what goes on in groups and the problems that can occur in groups. One of the problems that can occur in groups, and a good discussion about this in the introductory part to the chapter, is a concept called groupthink. And most of y'all probably know what that is, but groupthink deals with it's what the textbook will tell you is an inferior decision-making process. It's when you're all together in a group, all right, and everybody just starts to agree with everybody, and it can come from a number of reasons. It can come because there's somebody in the group that is so obnoxious that they pressure everybody, and everybody just doesn't want to fool with that anymore, so they go ahead and go with that decision. Another reason, and it's not a good reason that this happens, is because people want to be done. All right, so they've got a task that this group is taking care of, right, and they want to be done. So everybody agrees to do whatever the decision, the prominent decision is. I do want to mention, although he does not discuss this in the text, or they do not discuss this in the text. It used to just be written by Griffin, so I'm so used to saying him, is the concept of consensus. Now, a lot of people misdefine consensus. Consensus is that everybody in the group can agree to agree with the decision, all right? So when you have, let's say you're doing a democratic process and you have a 3-2 decision, all right, what consensus would be is that those two that didn't vote for it can support it. All right, and that's an issue that a lot of people don't realize. So when you say we've had a consensus decision, does not necessarily mean that everybody agreed with the decision at the outset. It means that they will agree to agree with the decision. So and so that's an important aspect. Last thing out of that introductory part is that usually when you're doing small group work, there are two functions. One is the task function, to take care of whatever it is you're going to take care of. And then the other is the relationship function. And that's the one that causes more problems than the task function. How many of you have ever been in a group before where you had to be in a group with somebody that is like, geez, I cannot stand working with this person? Or vice versa. Oh, I really like working with this person. I really like them. So therefore, I'm going to do, whatever they say or whatever. So both are important. And so you want to pay attention to that. The moving on to chapter 17 deals with a functional perspective of group decision making. And functional means what's the function of the group. So this is really more task oriented. You'll see a couple of things in the textbook about the types of functions that exist. Basically, if you look through those, you'll see what you have is it's a process of solving a problem. You have an analysis of the problem. You set goals for solving the problem. You identify alternatives, and then you evaluate the positive and negative characteristics of the decision that's been made. Now, those four functions are it's when we teach small group communication on campus, it's the first thing we start with are those requisite functions, all right? Which just means what's going to be the best thing to do, all right, for the best outcome, the most positive outcome that you can come up with. So you analyze the problem, you set your goals for the group, you identify alternatives, and you brainstorm those folks. And brainstorming means you don't put down anybody's others until you go back and then you relook at the list of brainstormed possible solutions, possible alternatives, and then you evaluate the positive or negative parts of it. One of the things that they give a good example in the textbook about how to go through that. And the example in the textbook showed that those who followed the process had better luck, right, with their projects that they were assigned to do than ones who did not. So what's the most important? All are important. All right, so you need to do all steps, is all that says. There's a section in the textbook called prioritizing the functions. All are important. And some people are better at doing different parts of that, so sometimes we'll do that. Now, let me tell you something about small groups in America. All right, in America, what we do is that when we have to do a function, because we're the most individualistic culture in the world, which we'll talk about when we talk about intercultural later in the textbook, but we separate the projects because we're the most individualistic, all right? So somebody has this part to do, somebody has this part to do, somebody has this part to do, all right? But, all right, don't try that in a collectivistic culture, all right? And the reason is because in collectivistic cultures, which is like Japan and Guatemala and India and Pakistan, the Middle East, the Far East is more collectivistic than us. And Central America is far more, and South America is far more collectivistic. Anyway, you go there, all right, don't do that. All right, what happens is that when you have a group functioning together to take care of something, everybody is a part of every job. All right, and so that's important. And we'll talk more about individualism and collectivism later this semester. The idea is, because this is about the functional approach, right, that the idea is a free flow of ideas. So people who squelch that free flow of ideas are breaking down the process. So you want to pay attention to that. There's a concept here talked about the functional utterance. What that is that's an uninterrupted statement of a single member that appears to perform some specific function, which is how the textbook defines, but it means that everybody needs voice, is all that means. Everybody has a functional part of this. The other talking about things such as reflective thinking. John Dewey's steps to reflective thinking is actually part of a process that we follow to take care of solving problems in speech making, but also we use it in small group, and there's a 6-step process for that. But when you look at that 6-step, you're going to go, that's the same thing as the requisite functions. You look at the problem, you pick it apart, you try to come up with ways to solve it, and then you evaluate those ways. But Dewey's steps to reflective thinking have you implement that, all right? You put it into practice. Then also added to Dewey, later theorists came in and added that you would go back and evaluate how well it worked. And if it didn't work, or it didn't work well, you started all over again and went through the process again. The ethical aspects here, they go into Habermas, which I'm not concerned about you all learning all about Habermas, but what that bottom line of that ethical reflection is that being ethical means being accountable for what you do. So when you're in a small group or in a group functioning or a functional group or whatever, all right, you need to do your part. All right, that's part of the ethical reflection. Everybody is accountable. So when a group makes a decision, according to Habermas's position, which is also according to most people's position, is that everybody in the group who took care of that, you know, if you had consensus and the people said they'd go along with that, you can't come back later and say, well, I didn't like that anyway. How many of you known somebody that does that, right? Ethically, they shouldn't be doing that if a group came up with a decision. So anyway, it's just this chapter has to do with how groups function and follow a process of functioning, to take care of whatever it is that you're going to try and solve in your problem solving. All right. Chapter 18 is about the symbolic convergence theory, and I love this. Is one of my favorite ones. So I do want you to recall about objective and interpretive theory. This one is more interpretive, and although some people do some objective research with the symbolic convergence theory, so you'll see in the textbook too. But in the beginning, right, this was referred to as fantasy theme analysis. All right, and what symbolic convergence just refers to is the coming together of ideas that this is how it's going to be. All right, the fantasy theme comes into play there. So it's a good theory to look at how people think and visualize things. So, and that's one of the reasons why it's a more interpretive theory. The fantasy theme analysis is used most often in small groups, although you can use it, this symbolic convergence theory. You can use it with individuals. It just is better. All right, because what you're going to do is you're going to look at the dramatizing message of what's going on in that small group. How are you visualizing things? So this fantasy that you see, right, is a fantasy, and I go into more detail in the PowerPoints about this, but the fantasy of when you put into practice what we just talked about in chapter 17, right, when you put that into practice, this is how it's going to be. This is how I see it, or we see it. So, that's the creative and imaginative interpretation of events, which is in the PowerPoint also. And the fantasies can be expressed as stories or jokes or metaphors, imaginative language. One of the things, and I do this in the PowerPoint, but that helps you visualize what this symbolic convergence theory is, or fantasy theme analysis, is I have people think, and when I teach it in the classroom, this is what I do. I have the students tell me what they visualized college being before they got here, right? And so, then they can come up with things that, oh, I thought it would be this, I thought it would be all parties, I thought I'd be studying all night long, I thought I'd be writing papers out the wazoo, all that. So they come up with that. Then the next thing you ask is, did that chain out? Now that's Borman's terminology. Ernest Borman's the theorist here. All right. And so did that chain out? All right. Is that what happened? All right. Because when a group has that fantasy theme, when they think that that's how it's going to look, all right, then does that chain out? Is that what happens? All right. And if it isn't what happens, then you have to deal with that aspect of it. But that's the fantasy chain that's talked about in the textbook. everybody, everybody needs to realize that, by the way, most fantasies don't chain out, that they do address in the textbook. But when they do, that fantasy will run, that fantasy theme will run throughout the history of that group, all right, because it will be a part of who they are. The fantasy is just looking at um, what happens, as I mentioned a few minutes ago about the creative and imaginative interpretation of events, if you do what that group says. All right, you have to come up with a decision, and if we put that decision into practice, that's what will happen, and does that chain out? So that's what the whole aspect of what's the content of it. What are the motives behind that fantasy? What are the cues that exist because of it, and the different types of fantasies that exist? When the group shares a fantasy, folks, that will make you more cohesive. All right, if you don't share the fantasy, you're going to see there's less cohesiveness in your group. So the whole concept of symbolic convergence then really talks about, bottom line, talks about that it's you're developing a sense of community with the other people in your group, or a sense of closeness, a sense of cohesiveness, unity, solidarity are the words that they use in the textbook. So this is when the group becomes a we, or an us, all right, or an ours, versus I, or me, or mine. All right, so that's where you know that the fantasy has chained out for your group. What do you look for in the fantasy if you're going to use this concept? The characters that play a role, the plots, all right, the plot lines, right? The scene where it's going to take place, sanctioning agents, who addresses this, who can say, yes, this is what we'll do. All right. It's a important thing to realize that when you have the fantasy and a group shares that fantasy, all right, it's a more healthy group. It's a more healthy culture. If those fantasies are destructive, all right, and may create group paranoia, as the textbook calls it, or depression, the best idea is to cut the chain off and change the fantasy. All right. The other aspects are being able to encourage the sharing of the drama with other people, especially your bosses, if this is a work group, and so that people also climb on board your fantasy. All right, so. And it's one of the most common ones used in a small group, but it's also used in public speaking as well. Okay, we move from small group into organizational communication, which is a common move, right? And even though they've included public speaking, public address in this section, we won't get to that until next week. But the organizational communication section is a good thing. I want you to make sure that you look at figure OC-1 on page 242 in your textbook, because that talks about the principles of organizational communication, about the chain of command, about the unity of command, that everybody supports where the command comes from. Now, organizational communication we often refer to as business communication, because those are considered to be organizations, but it's also other organizations you belong to. Clubs, or even your faith backgrounds, your anything that you do that is an organization. All right, so it's another form of group communication, but in a different way. There might be a division of work in the group, and authority and responsibility. Who's in control? Discipline is there discipline for when mistakes are made, or when people violate, right? Guidelines. And then subordination of individual interest to general interest is a fascinating one to me, because us being the most individualistic culture in the world, we often aren't willing to uh, subjugate ourselves to, being the subordinate. We want to be the ones in control of our own destiny, our own thing. So it's an important one to look at. And then they talk some about the mechanistic approach. Different approaches, the mechanics of how a group works. And so there's one that looks at it as a living system, like a body, a human body type thing. So it's a living system. Cultural approach, which deals with looking for shared meanings that are unique to that specific organization, that culture, that organizational culture. And then the critical approach, which deals with the idea that about picking apart the process, basically. That's what the critical means there. You pick it apart. Traditional managers, as Dietz said, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes, but overwhelming concern for how control, all right, as the preferred means of cost cutting and efficacy in a business, all right, take place. So he picked it apart according to, that one really deals with corporate decision making, corporate organizations more so than the other ones. So chapter 19 deals with the cultural approach to organizations. Gertz and Pakanowski, I say it the Polish way because I speak Polish, so but looks like Pakanowski to you, but this chapter deals with looking at an organization as a culture. Simple as that, right? And of course, none of the material here is terribly simple as that. So, but culture refers to having shared meaning, shared understanding, shared sense making. Making sense of the organizational activity is what that deals with. So basically what Gertz and Pakanowski talk about is that culture is a metaphor for organizational life. And indeed, that's the first heading of the section in the textbook. So, it's looking at as culture as the root metaphor for looking at an organization. So, and these are different in different cultures. They talk about in Japan about how cultural face saving is important. We'll talk about that later this semester again when we talk about intercultural communication. So our culture, right, our culture's organizations are different than other cultures' organizations. They define and talk about what culture is, webs of significance, systems of shared meanings, close-knit societies have subcultures, so do organizations, right? So it's not just always one overall culture. There are little subcultures. We refer to them as co-cultures these days. They still use some of the sub, because sub ties it to being less than, and that's why. So most comm theory materials refer to it as co-cultures now. And then also they talk about cultural performances, all right? And then they also talk about what culture is not. So you have culture that exists and culture within the organization, and then things that are not really part of culture. And your organization's culture. Think of your workplace. What's the culture of your workplace? That's what this chapter deals with. All right. And of course, this is a more, if you're going to study this, you're going to use a more interpretive approach. And they go into a good discussion about how to do ethnographies in organizational, studying out organizations, about mapping out how this organization works, what it does, how it goes about it, etc. So make sure that you look at that, right? Then there's a concept that called thick description, and what that does is that takes those, if you're doing an ethnography, you got to look at it. So what that does, that thick description takes intertwined layers of common meaning that exist with you, all right, that underlie what people say and do in the organization. If I walked into your organization, I wouldn't know that. If I did an ethnography, at the end of my studying your organization, I would hope that I would know those things. So, You have to interpret as well as observe in order to get that understanding, the description, really, right, and about what um, that get to the bottom of that metaphor that says, okay, this is why this is a culture. So uh, they talk a lot about using other metaphors in this, because you have other metaphors that come into play when you start talking about culture. And then they talk about the interpretation of that, symbolic interpretation, narratives. And we'll talk more about narrative theory when we talk about public communication. But what are the corporate stories? What are your personal stories? What are your collegial stories about getting along with other people? Because those exist in a culture, and those are all important part of it. Another aspect is a ritual. Organizations have rituals. If you work in a place where you have to clock in, that's part of your ritual. If you have an organization that has a weekly meeting every Monday at 2 p.m., that's a part of your ritual. If you're part of an organization that has something that occurs and everybody takes part in that, that's part of the ritual. All right. And rituals are extremely important to the culture of an organization. So keep that in mind. Can a manager be an agent of cultural change? They ask. It's like, well, of course they can. It depends on how they manage. So I always think, whenever I get to that, I'm like, well, duh, of course they can. The critique on this one is that Griffin et al. Probably think that this isn't the best because they ask the question, is the cultural approach useful? Right there, the language there says, okay, they're going to say it isn't. That's a no-brainer. Chapter 20 deals with communicative constitution, right? And that's McPhee's theory, and it's one that's not real commonly studied. It basically deals with what constitutes the organization, what makes up the organization. And so it deals more with instead of the manager dictating priorities, all employees must possess the freedom to initiate projects they believe will benefit the company. All right. So in other words, the organization gets constituted by the people that are a part of it. So you'll want to make sure that's in the opening statements of on page 255 of this chapter. So make sure you read that. Basically, who these folks, what these theorists believe is that organizations exist because communication brings the organization into existence. So communication needs to flow through the organization. All right. Most of you all probably know of organizations where the communication doesn't flow, and it probably makes most of you all uncomfortable. So the aspect of communication and definition of constitution there is constitution refers to it's the communication that calls the organization into being. It's what constitutes an organization. So we're not talking like a document like the U.S. Constitution. We're talking about this is what constitutes an organization. And then sense making. All right. So in order for you to make sense of your being a part of this organization, you need to understand how the communication flows through the organization. So they talk about the different flows of communication in an organization here. How does a member of this organization negotiate what they want to do? How do you self-structure? How do you take care of yourself also? You need to figure out who's who in the organization as part of that, the self-structuring. Activity coordination is part of another flow. All right, it's how do I get the job done that I'm supposed to do? Then institutional positioning. And that's how do you deal with other people in the organization and outside of your organization. So those are important. The biggest issue about these four flows, it's a short chapter, but it's an important chapter. A lot of folks don't look at organizations from this perspective, but it's still an important aspect. Four principles of the four flows. All four flows are important and necessary. Back to the, membership negotiation, self-structuring, activity coordination, and then institutional positioning, dealing with people and organizations. Different flows happen in different places, and I would add to that to their list and times. All right, because one day this might happen and the next day it might not happen. The same message can address multiple flows is another important principle, and different flows address different audiences, and those four principles of four flows are important. They have a good discussion in there about studying an abusive work environment and why it was abusive due to the communication flows. So make sure you look at that. The critique is that this is Constitution really so simple? It sounds simple on the surface, but if you dig into those things, it isn't simple at all. That's what their critique is. Yeah, so it's something to make sure that you look at carefully there. It sounds easy, four flows, I got it, but it might not be. Sorry, I needed to open the other one. And then the last chapter, chapter 21, refers to the critical theory of communication in organizations, and that's Dietz's theory. He uses some good examples here about different places. He used to use this great example of Aaron Brockovich, if any of you all saw that movie. But he has taken that out, goes into different things. So the bottom line here is, if any of you all saw the movie Aaron Brockovich, is that decisions made at the upper level, all right, need to be critiqued. All right, that's why he refers to the critical theory. All right, you can't just take everything at face value, and because the organization said, or the manager said, or the owner said, or the president said, or etc. All right, you can't just take that at face value. You have to pick it apart. All right, and so that's what this theory is based on. How do I pick it apart? So the first thing you look at is the colonization, all right, of the corporation. Multinational corporations are huge in our culture, so it's important to look at that. And they talk. Dietz would say that most of the decisions are made in what he calls the corporate executive suite. In other words, the boss person makes the decisions. All right, and is that a good way to do it? And how do you colonize the colonization? All right, is important to studying how an organization works. It's we're seeing less and less of this. We're seeing where a lot of large corporations have given some freedom to other people in the organization to actually what's the word I'm looking for, to actually become a part of the full decision making, as opposed to boss person says this is how it is, so that's how it is, comes out of the corporate executive suite, and all of you in the organization have to live with it. So this theory also deals with managers, talks about information and how information flows in an organization. In the transmission of messages, another communication model is given here. So good, I may have the wrong page number. On page 269, there's a good model there in your and I'm going to change that right now. No, I'm not. I'll fix it in a minute. I'm afraid I'll forget to do it as well, because I'll do that right now. Talking about the strategies that are used, the consent of the workers, the participation of the workers, and then how people are involved, and they cross over each other. So make sure you look at that. Managerial control is a part of this co-determinant, which says the top down that I was explaining earlier. Co-determination is where it becomes collaborative, that the workers and the people in that organization get to have a say in there. Good discussion about what's the difference between leadership and managerialism. Some of you all have worked for a person who's very managerial. That's the person who said, because I'm the boss, because I said so. If you don't like it, you can quit. It's my way or the highway. So that's an aspect of managerialism that most people don't like. And you'll read a good discussion about managerialism. And Dietz would claim that most corporate successes or failures are due to factors beyond managerial control. And so Dietz doesn't get it why if you're a manager and you're trying to control that, because often you have no real control over it. There's a discussion about, are you willing to give in to covert control? All right. What that calls is most of you will give willingly, all right, to your organization without getting much in return. All right. And Dietz would call that consent. But a lot of times that covert control is more or less what we might call passive aggressiveness, right? You try to get people, managerialism will lead people to do that. You'll do this for me because, I've made you think that you're going to get something out of this. You can tell it's Sunday morning again, the sun's in my eyes. Because of that, we get distorted communication. Do people get free expression of what they want? No voice, but you can express what you want, but it doesn't matter. All right. Is your organization that way? Stakeholders, they talk about participation and stakeholders, like, are you investors? Are you workers? Are you consumers? Are you suppliers? Etc. And those are important because they're if you know your role that you're playing, then Dietz would say, okay, so you're giving into this covert control because you know your position, right? You know what you're supposed to do. Then they give you this model called the PARC model, P-A-R-C, politically attentive relational constructivism. No. I wouldn't ask you a question about that to begin with, but it's this whole process of paying attention to the political communication, the relationship that takes place in the organization, and the stakeholders and the authorities and those types of people, and what do they play? What role do they play? Then Dietz' final thing is that he asks, he doesn't ask, he would say he would have managers take the role of mediators rather than persuaders. So that would be his ideal, all right? Which, is probably, he's like, okay, that's a whole lot easier than being told this is what you need to do, or trying to persuade people. The ethical reflection, they ask about pragmatism, and what pragmatism deals with is, will it work? All right. And Griffin et al. Say, in other words, this theory works, all right, because you're picking apart how people respond to managerialism. That's the bottom line out of this, is what is the manager doing in the organization that affects the communication? The biggest critique on this is that, and as you read it, you're going to go, okay, I get this critique. It's complex. but it's about a simple idea. So basically what has happened, in my personal opinion, is that Dietz has taken this fairly simple thing about managerialism and turned it into this big, huge theory that everybody goes, now, how do I use that? How do I apply that? There are parts of it that are easy to apply, right? But it's not the easiest. And so, Dietz would basically say that a positive alternative to managerialism is difficult to work out, both in conception of a way to avoid it and then in actual practice. Anyway, those are the chapters for this week. And I would ask that you remember the test goes up Thursday at around noontime, comes down Sunday at 5 p.m. It closes down. Again, last time, 7 of you missed the deadline. All right. I'm not going to take them without penalty if I take them late. And again, you send it to me and ask me. Of the 7 of you, 4 of you, I had to email back and say, are you asking me or are you telling me here it is? All right. That's just, since we've just been talking about corporate control, it's just common practice when you are late with work, all right, that you ask the professor. Same as you would in the workplace. You don't just, have something to do and bring it in 2 days later and say, oh, here it is. Yeah, you deal with why it's late. So anyway, off my soapbox. I hope you all have a great week, and I will see you again next Sunday. Bye.